Hello and welcome to the HR People Pod, the CIPD's fortnightly podcast, bringing you the topical stories and expert insights on issues impacting business and the profession. My name's David D'Souza, I'm Director of Profession at the CIPD, and joining me in the studio we have...
Carl Quilliam, the CIPD's Public Affairs Manager.
And...
Una Johnston.
And once again...
Melanie Still.
And Gareth Neal.
And I'm really looking forward to today because Mel's disagreed with everything that I've said this morning, including the things where I've agreed with her. It's a pleasure to have you all join this show. This week's episode is going to be slightly different because we're having a deep dive focus on the implication of the UK government's Employment Rights Bill, which came out yesterday. So this is hot off the press. We'd like to remind listeners that the CIPD is politically independent. We're not here to play politics. What matters to us is championing better working lives and the profession that we serve. We'll continue to engage with the government and other parties to influence their position on a host of issues on behalf of our members. But just before we dive into the key areas covered in the bill, I wanted to come back to Carl to shed a little bit of light on or a lot of light, Carl, it's up to you.
No pressure.
Degree of pressure, either way. On the broader implications for employers and also just a bit of the stuff that's been happening behind the scenes. So first off, it's probably worth talking about the 3 documents that were released yesterday, each of them slightly less complex than the previous one.
So, yeah, we got the full bill yesterday, so that's over 150 pages, 28 provisions. There's a lot to digest in there. We also, alongside that, got the explanatory notes. So if anyone's had a chance to Google it yet, they might have found that on the Parliament website. And then after that, we got what's called the Next Steps document, which is about 16 pages. And that runs through, in a lot simpler language, what's broadly happening with the legislation and some of the next steps. It doesn't give us all the detail we probably like, but it does give us a kind of direction of travel from the government.
Fantastic. And just for anyone who does want to delve into it, there's a couple of things I'd say. First of all, the bill in itself is almost impossible to make sense of because it will say things like we're removing one word from the 14th paragraph from the document that isn't included here. The explanatory notes are super, super helpful because it kind of says this is what we're trying to do and why and when it may take place. And the Next Steps document is really useful for a lot of things that you thought might be in the bill but haven't been there. At the CIPD, if you remember, one of the things you can do is go on our website and we have broken down the key elements of the bill, the implications that they have, and also the timelines. We will keep updating that as future consultations take place. So please do make use of it. We've got the podcast coming out today. That won't be a surprise to you because you're listening to it as I'm speaking about this, but we'll also keep going with videos and other things so that we'll be a one-stop shop for knowing how it impacts you in terms of the profession. So coming back to that, we've got all of this information.
Yeah.
How much in there was what we expected? How much shows that the government's still committed to consultation, and what happens next?
I think from a CIPD perspective, we've been quite engaged in the lead up to this. I think the vast majority of this is what was expected from people that have had those conversations. I think perhaps if the last thing you heard about it was the Labour Party in opposition and it was their New Deal for Working People. There's probably a few more surprises in there. Actually, some of the things in there may have been moderated or certainly will be subject to consultation in a way that you might not have expected. So I think particularly that's a really sort of key point, I think, for people listening, is that this is a big piece of legislation. Like I say, it's 150 pages. It's a lot of different provisions, but we've got quite a long timeline now for a lot of it. So unfair dismissal has been a really big piece that's come out from the profession, particularly when we've had conversations, when we've done surveys. There's been a lot of concern about the scrapping of the unfair dismissal qualifying period. We now know that's definitely going to happen, but what we also know is there'll be a new probation period, and that's going to be consulted on next year. So in 2025, it isn't going to come in until the earliest autumn 2026. So there's quite a long period now on something like that for us to both feed into what the bones of that probation period look like, but also then to understand it and implement it further down the line. And that's the same across most areas. There was a conversation that happened yesterday where just after the bill was introduced, you and I were sort of listening to civil servants talk about some of these timelines. the vast majority of the consultations are going to come in 2025, and actually not early in 2025. So likely March, April, maybe earliest, we're going to get some of the big consultations. That said, there's a couple. So for those interested, particularly in the trade union provisions, it's likely those are going to come fairly soon. So this year, there'll probably be, without getting into the detail just yet, but there'll be bits there that are consulted on straight away, and there's probably going to be some more consultation at the back end because there'll be secondary legislation as well. But that's one of the big bits that's going to come sooner. The rest of it likely next year.
What are guaranteed hours, 0 hours? Is that another one that they kind of said they go quite quickly at?
In terms of the consultation piece, there will be a consultation around how 0 hours impact agency workers. That's going to be the other thing that kind of comes this side of Christmas. But yeah, there'll likely to be more next year as well.
So for anyone listening who's been reading headlines over the last few months saying that they shouldn't be hiring, that this is going to fundamentally change everything, that next Tuesday the world is going to be like we've never known it. The reality is this is going to be phased. We still don't know for the most part exactly what's happening in all the different spaces. The government's committed to consultation for a really extended period of time. And one of the other things that they said to us was that they will phase that consultation as well. So they're not trying to do everything at once. Mm-hmm. So they can relax a little bit.
I think so. I think there's always a tension with this kind of thing where businesses want the detail soon, and that's one of the things, the calls that people have made, but actually we can't get that because of the consultation. So this long timeline is good because it allows that both that consultation, but then hopefully towards the back end of 2025 we'll start to get more of that detail, and there'll be a kind of recognition that businesses need time to implement this stuff.
Excellent. And look, for the rest of the podcast, we brought Carl in so that if I say anything incorrect, he can put me on the right track really quickly. But
he can give you a little kick under the table.
Having both worked through about 400 pages of text yesterday, the other big take that I had from it, so it'd be good for you to confirm it, is that there were quite a few things that people were expecting to happen pretty close up front that are actually a longer term. So single employment status is one that's been pushed out. So that's not even in the next steps beyond referencing that that's going to be over a longer time frame. And the other one is right to disconnect, which we've spoken about on this podcast prior. Looks unlikely that that'll happen at pace, and it looks far more likely to be a code of practice than it would be anything else. Is that about right? Anything else I've missed?
No, I mean that's exactly it, and it's on those things. It's at this point, it's reading the tea leaves a little bit as to when they're going to come in. Hopefully, there will be some of those conversations behind the scenes with civil servants, and we'll get a bit more certainty. But that's exactly right. I mean, the thing that sort of says really is that we've got 150 pages of legislation. We're also going to get loads more secondary legislation, and we're going to get codes of practice. So it will be a lot, but there has been a recognition from government that actually this needs to be phased. It's not all going to, we're not going to get 100 consultations all at once. So we will be able to feed in to the stuff that's in the bill, but then things like that, there'll be that bit more time as well.
Brilliant. So if you're a practitioner listening to this, one, relax just a little bit. It's certainly enough to recognise that it's not everything happening at once, and it's not happening now. Secondly, please do follow us on LinkedIn and other channels. We've just upgraded our website functionality to make it easier to find things as well. So do go on there and look out. And as I say, we'll keep those key tables, those timelines. We'll obviously update all the supporting documentation as we find out more. But you can at least relax this weekend, or at least not worry about extra things arriving on your desk related to this. Really want to bring in Una, Mel and Gareth now. That's a whistle-stop tour because there's so many elements to it. But I was just curious if any of you had any other elements that you noticed in the bill that you thought were worth talking about. We're going to do a deeper dive into the single enforcement body, unfair dismissal, and 0 hours contracts or guaranteed hours as we kind of work through this podcast. But anything else catch your eye?
I think that the sexual harassment part, and particularly the fact that the third party is now back in, which they took out from the previous act, and I think that could be a challenge from a hospitality perspective, depending on how it's written. Currently, it's very much A equals B equals C equals D, which is very difficult to follow sometimes. But it's about actually how you avoid risk, and it's going to have to take a lot of thought from hospitality companies, because we obviously have members of the general public coming in, drinking, and anything, could potentially happen. We try and prevent that, obviously, but it's difficult. It can be a challenge. So, it's a really important piece of legislation, but I wasn't expecting that to be part of this particular bill.
Yeah, so there are two prime changes, and we spoke about a couple of podcasts ago, actually, sexual harassment and the kind of requirement to do risk assessment. Two changes seem to be a strengthening of the language to say that all reasonable steps must be taken, not just reasonable steps. And secondly, that piece around third parties. So making sure that you recognise your commitment as an employer isn't just to protect people from colleagues, it's to protect people, your workforce, kind of full stop. So yes, not one that I think have been heavily kind of trailered.
No, not at all.
But a kind of important piece. Mel?
Yeah, definitely that one. I thought it was good that was in there. I think some of the other things relating to statutory sick pay, a lot of people yesterday were like, well, that happens anyway in most companies. Well, there's an awful lot of companies who do the absolute minimum. They're not really tiny companies necessarily too. So I think bringing everyone up to a particular standard is not a bad thing to do that. I liked as well some of the protection relating to paternity, maternity, that kind of thing. Again, good businesses have gone way beyond some of that, but it's not the case actually in a lot of in some of the big names that they don't do that. So anything where it kind of pushes us into 2024 and rather than relying on businesses doing the right thing. The tips and the gratuities thing, I obviously was my background years and years ago, I always thought that if you do good service you should get your tips, and I've been coming as a customer now, I've become increasingly disappointed with businesses who that forms part of their wage or what have you. So again, if this just forces that behaviour to change, then that helps. And I guess the thing, what we've just talked about, is great that we know we've got this lead period. But I would say, with the trade union side of things, we're not going to major on it here, but there are a lot of companies who over the last few years have been having these conversations. And I think there'll be quite a few members who will appreciate getting support and understanding kind of where they stand with that. And, hopefully someone who's got too many days to count of non-reckonable service for strike action back in her early career and non-pensionable, let's hope it becomes a good thing where we can have really good constructive conversations with employees, employers and trade unions. And Una was saying that before we come in here, make it a modern workplace,
definitely.
Which I like hearing. That's got to be where we're all aiming towards, right?
I see it as some practical pragmatism that needed an overhaul. It's 40 years probably since massive reform, and the work generation coming through needs that kind of simplicity, remove some of the complexities. So for me, I could see that this is a modern type of working. It's more about being inclusive, There was lots of things for parents and women and better protection, and that's been long overdue, So, and to bring out the best in people, we know that bereavement can be crippling. So, to recognise that from day one, I think, it's just how it should be. For me personally, the 0 hours, we've used 0 hours before. Hopefully, we've always used them in a way that's provided flexibility. So again, it's a modern way of bringing more innovation into the workforce and enabling that flexibility. If you've got students or people that just want to work temporarily, as long as you provide them a guarantee within a fixed period, you're not abusing them. I applauded that unscrupulous employers will now be stopped abusing that particular way of employing people. But for me, it was pragmatism and modernisation, and a sigh of relief. Hurrah! We're starting to kick some of the old practices.
It's a quite unequivocally positive reaction.
Yeah.
there.
She is glass half full. I love it on a Friday.
Yeah.
Look, we've been regularly polling our members. We'll continue to do so, holding senior roundtables as well. It's going to be really interesting to see the reception when people have had a chance to reflect as well. But it's nice to at least start with someone cheery on the day after.
There's plenty of time.
Yeah.
There is.
Too many endorphins, probably.
And I think, Mel, that point around unions is really well made. I think it's going to be something that we need to look at our support for, and members need to reflect on. Greater chance of union recognition in organisations that haven't prior. It's a different skill set, different protections that are sitting in there as well. And I think broadly, one of the other things that's been interesting from our point of view has been that kind of tripartite model of consultation that the government's going through, so involving unions, involving business leaders, organisations like ourselves, and the government itself. And you've had the social partnership model in Wales for quite a few years now, and that's an interesting one for people to just kind of cast their eyes across and think about how that works and the ramifications of that.
Can I just pick up on the union piece? Because for hospitality, that's quite a challenge, because we don't really have a classic union for hospitality. And also from an HR perspective, the HR teams wouldn't have had experience of working with unions. And that in itself means that there's an education piece for the HR teams, because particularly the younger generation would never have even experienced having to deal with unions unless it was literally at a disciplinary meeting, is usually where you first meet a union person. There are challenges with it as well. I think there is, if it's a broadly positive that it's about working with businesses to give good practices for employees, that's great. If it's the other way around, that's a challenge.
I worked for ASOS in a previous role, and so I absolutely echo what you said about a younger HR function that's never had exposure to unions. But if it's seen as a partnership and not adversarial and not going to, absolutely to butt heads, it's a way of working through a particular problem with that group of individuals, or taking a different stance of, we've got this complex issue, how do we work together to resolve it for the better good of what we're trying to do for our workforce. I've worked with unions where, I grew up in kind of financial services, where it was, a staff association, and it got very much, you do as I say. And I always took the view, even at ASOS, where, they were striking outside, I went out and said, look, who wants a cup of tea? Does somebody want anything to eat? And they were like, yeah, I'd love a cup of tea. And so that's how we brokered that conversation. We're humans at the end of the day. We want to get the best out of, how do we get this conflict resolution going?
So it's not 100% guaranteed. So we will try and provide more kind of content to our members on it. But a cup of tea seems a good starting point. Coffee should be made available as well. People have different preferences. So I'm going to move us on to, I guess, our first substantive topic, which is around unfair dismissal and probation periods. So when it was trailed, I think a lot of the media coverage was suggesting that essentially from day one of a contract, people would have exactly the same rights and protections as they would have if they'd been with the organisation for 20, 25 years. And there was a lot of pushback on that. What appears to be what is going to be consulted on, I think that's the best way of framing it now, is that there will be a probation period, potentially of 9 months, where there are different levels of protection afforded, slightly unclear at the moment. If an organisation were in a position where they felt that someone needed to leave during that period, they would need to have a formal meeting with the person where they could be accompanied, where they'd have to make that clear to them, essentially running through what might be a relatively normal business process elsewhere. That appears to be the substance of it at the moment. So for any organisation that had stopped hiring, and apparently there were some of those in the media, on the basis of this change, it appears at the very least it's different to that. There's still going to be consultation around whether it is 9 months. So the government has expressed their preference for 9 months, but has also said they'll continue to review that and to consult. It has definitely been an area of contention for employers. We've spoken to, as you can imagine, a range of major employers and SMEs with concerns about this. Genuinely wanted to open it up to the group with how it's now currently formulated. How big an impact do you think it will have?
I think it goes back to everything in terms of you were saying about the time we've got ahead of this. I think it's about not panicking and planning. And we were already, I talked to my team about this. We were already thinking ahead. We knew this was coming, so we've already changed some of our induction processes. So we've got proper forms that hopefully will align with what the legislation's coming. It's also an education piece for managers as well about how to deal with performance and how to handle people's capability to do the role and some of the challenges with that. And I think the fact that it's likely to come through in 2026 gives you time to actually plan out what you're going to do. Do I think that this is really scary? No, it is if you don't do anything about it. If you just think, oh well, it would just continue as we currently are, and then suddenly realise, oh my goodness, what do we do? And I think the change from 2 years to potentially 9 months or even 6 months, as long as you're prepared for that and as long as you're thinking that process through, then I think actually it's not as scary as it's made out to be.
Yeah, and it's a really good point to make. So we are probably 2 years away from this. So they've said autumn 2026 will be the earliest. Equally, there's another couple of things that they'll need to work through, including compensation for people in that position or who have a grievance or a legitimate grievance in that space. Mel, thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is, right? They put it out
very
there.
true. Struggle
There's no
to
going
disagree
back.
on that one, yeah.
It's there. So, I think it is challenging. We're in a situation at the moment where the tribunal service doesn't work, right? So we've got a 2-year qualifying period. It's hell when you're in those situations and how long it takes to get through the process if you end up in that. It's hard to advise businesses stick it out sometimes and go through the actual process because actually what you've done is correct. And then it's like, oh, should we just pay to get this out of our hair? So do I think that by doing this, it changes the relationship, the behaviours to treat people better and such like? No, not really. I can't see that this is the shining light that's going to change everything, right, by bringing in this legislation. I hope as part of it, we work out, okay, if people are going to be able to claim from day one, how does that actually work in reality? How does that get supported with ACAS and all the rest of the paraphernalia that actually comes through when you go through this? And I think we have to start there because just by adding more into the current system, I think we'd all say would be a terrible way forward, right? The probation period, I think, there will be some employers that will be, really strong, with managers in that sense of it goes back in time as far as I'm concerned. That's how I started my career. You have a probation period, you use that time, you test out whether the person can do the job and vice versa. And if not, then that's the time you do what you need to do. So I don't think that's dissimilar. I think it becomes more harder than where over the years. I think in the UK, we've probably softened that a little bit more. But in Europe and such like, it's not dissimilar.
Yeah, we certainly know of organisations that deliberately remove the probation period and will now have to think about that in a different way. But equally, the processes that you'd have to go through seem really similar to what you do most places in their life cycle. Yeah. Uni, you've been a ray of sunshine so far. I'm assuming you think this is the greatest thing to happen to the planet ever.
Do you know what? I do think it goes back to what I said earlier. It's simplification, it's efficiency. If you've been wronged, you don't want to wait 2 years to be able to fix that. And if that's scarred your employment experience, and you need to have your right to protection. But do you need 2 years for it? So I do think, as we've discussed and as Mel said, we've got a system that's not working and it's log jammed. So if there's a way to make that more efficient and effective, then do that and make sure that agency works effectively. Will it stop us hiring? Absolutely not. I do think you need to get your ducks in a row. You need to understand if you've got someone that's not performing or you've got someone that's joined your organisation that is definitely there to cause trouble, then how do you manage that in an efficient and effective way? And it's not ruthless, but you need, as an employer, to be able to deal if you've got a bad apple and not be afraid of that. So you need to have your processes. You need to be able to understand what you can and can't do. And we've got time to work that through. And there's enough skin in the game that we know how to handle that if you do that effectively without it coming back to bite you.
Yeah.
So I personally am
and
not
protection
frightened
has
of
been
it.
there from day one for
Yeah.
we're talking about capability predominantly, aren't we?
Yeah,
right,
so
in here?
automatically unfair.
So, if you're treated unfairly in any other way, you've had that protection there from day one on it. I mean, with some of those cases, I would like them to be seen and to be heard much quicker, because I think spending your time in that system waiting for something to be heard
Can be crippling.
is crippling, yeah. For both businesses and individuals, it's just not. So I start from the position, and I don't know if in the conversations you guys have had any, how are we going to sort out the bigger issue of what we all say isn't working at the moment? Because that has to be unlocked before we then kind of change the legislation side.
Can I just talk from an employee perspective? Because personally, I got dismissed just before the 2-year gap. This goes back about 10 years ago.
Deliberately, probably.
Yeah, deliberately.
Yeah.
And, from a person, it was a complete shock. And I at the time, I didn't really fully
It winged
understand
you,
the law.
yeah.
And I think actually there is a point here where if you can't work out whether someone's good enough within the first 2 years, that's a bit worrying. Actually, it should be that there is a more reasonable time limit for the employee, and that there are processes in place. So I think there's a balance here, and I think absolutely businesses need time to assess someone, particularly someone in a senior position, because you can't work that out within a few weeks. But there does need to be a balance and an element of protection for the employees. The one final thing I'll say on this is it is the Christmas day for employment lawyers. They are going to make an absolute killing out of this.
On
There will be
settlement agreements. Yeah.
galore. This
Yeah.
is their dream, but that dream will be made by employers who aren't planning and prepared for this sort of stuff, and that's the key bit here. If you are planned, prepared, you should be able to handle most situations.
Yeah, the risk appears to be minimal if you go through a minimal amount of formal process.
Precisely.
It doesn't appear onerous currently. We'll have to wait and see what comes out of the consultation.
I think that's true, but I would just say not all businesses are equal in size, in support, in setup. Yeah. And we've got many businesses in this country now who are still quite big, who they have a very small junior HR function. They might have a lawyer on tap. Now, we can debate whether that's right or wrong, but I think we can't just kind of go into this as well, because the world of work has changed, but, in a good
Radically,
way as well.
it needs to, yeah.
So what you've done there, Mel, is you've interrupted my bridge. Right?
Sorry.
Find another
Segue.
segue. Find another segue.
So what's happened? So what's happened there, just for clarity for anyone watching or listening, is that my next sentence was going to be, however, we know from many employers they don't necessarily have the structure or the expertise to be able to prepare
read your
for
mind.
that. I know, it's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, it's alignment. But I was just like, you need to remember. And I'm like, no, I have, and it's even in the script.
We're getting like the husband or wife on podcast now. We need to change this.
Cool, I couldn't choose anyone better.
Oh my God, it's on tape and on video.
and you don't even have to reciprocate.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
No harassment here.
So look, there are a few challenges here, which is that we can see a few places in the bill where there's probably an increased chance of tribunal, and that will be for most organisations. The balance of risk slightly shifts, and there are ways to mitigate it. One of the challenges that's been raised by the FSB, amongst others, so the Federation of Small Businesses, but we've also raised as well, is that the education and capability in small organisations and knowledge of the law is also and often lower just by dint of circumstance. Those two things combine potentially to put increased pressure on ACAS, who attempt to avoid things going to tribunal through mediation. The tribunal service itself, which is already in many cases creaking, leading to really long times for either employees or employers, depending on which the circumstances, to access justice and resolution. But also we've got a range of enforcement bodies which the government is planning to bring together under a single enforcement body, which is, I think, a sensible plan. I haven't heard anyone say that isn't a sensible plan, but the timing and phasing of that is key, because what you don't want is for there to be more and more pressures on systems that haven't yet been reviewed. So
Correct.
the idea is to have a fair work agency. There's a broader point here, and I want to open it up to you all, which is there's a balance between education and enforcement with this change. So I'm curious as to, where do you think the government's got a role, where different organisations have got a role to help people understand their legal rights and their legal obligations? And equally, what would you want from that single enforcement body that would really either give it teeth or make sure that it was acting in a proportionate way? So I'll open that up to you all, but I absolutely agree. Like, there's a greater burden of risk on SMEs, and we need to recognise that as we go through. So therefore, we've got to have better mitigation for SMEs.
I mean, I used to have my own small business, and I know that the challenges and the conversations I would have with other people who had small businesses who were constantly in fear, and sometimes in fear of just simply employing people, full stop. Calling it a single enforcement body is absolutely what it shouldn't be called, because that scares living daylights out of people.
I was going to say that's prohibitory, isn't
Totally.
it?
So they are going to call it a fair work agency. Do you prefer that?
Well,
is that
I
nicer?
know it's more actually. It should be about advisory and support first, and then enforcement later. So it should be about advising and supporting businesses, and then if they are ignoring what they should be doing, then enforcing. Because I think there's an element of kind of a yellow card here that some businesses need as a bit of a warning, because actually you can easily make a mistake, or you can easily make a slip up when it comes to employment law. It's very, it's complex. And as you said, Mel, there are often very junior HR people within small businesses that don't have that experience and knowledge. I've set up HR teams within small businesses, and quite often there are mistakes galore when you simply go for a contract, let alone anything else. And I think that's the real challenge, is that there needs to be a support out there for small businesses to be able to be more confident in making decisions that are right for them and right for the employee.
I've worked for SMEs and been parachuted in when there's been problems, and I think what we've got to do is help them in a way that is going to, again, make things not debilitating, and make things easy for them to find or access. So it needs some sort of overhaul. We know that. And it's probably time to say that needs to probably be a bit more radical. I think the fines that they need to put in place, again, for unscrupulous employers need to basically bite and have teeth, rather than there, don't do that again. So it's a balance, isn't it? And I think it's providing the education, the signposting, the comprehensive guidelines, but also when it's at the other end of the spectrum, being able to say, you're not be able to do that. That's just not on. And we'll find you, we'll get you where it hurts, but not stop small businesses still operating the way that they need to operate.
That yellow card concept, so one of the things that we do know, because we've got plenty of data on it, is that minimum wage violations quite often are not intentional. It's a problem in the calculation. Yeah. It's a lack of awareness. What you haven't got, to your point, is it's not about being an unscrupulous employer. It's about finding adherence to the law trickier, or the understanding of it trickier. If we're making a raft of changes, I think there needs to be sufficient education before you get to the enforcement. Yeah. And that's different to saying if employers are acting in a completely incorrect way deliberately, that shouldn't be enforced. But I think it's a really interesting point around how you tell and how you separate, but also how you have good enough oversight. Mel, I'll give you the kind of closing word on this one, because you introduced it.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I don't think I have much confidence, if I'm honest, setting up a new agency. I think what's always interesting in government is, business being such a big thing, but when you work for departments, and that it's always the one that gets dissembled, or or it gets split up. It never has the consistency or continuity. And one thing we know about businesses, that's what they need. So setting this up, I mean, that in itself is no small order. So we create it. Then what is it going to do? It should be there, right? But we've got different departments already that should be there for business and support. But when you try and get to engage and to take that agenda forward, it's incredibly difficult. Apart, if you want to go and talk about defence or something else, you can easily get in there and talk about that. But business seems to be one of those things, strangely for me, that doesn't seem to hold the same whack. So let's see if it kind of materialises. Can it materialise quick enough? I kind of would like it to contain, business people who are going to be a bit disruptive on it and challenge, the status quo, not all the friends and family from the party. And I think it should have some teeth. I completely agree. There has been some really terrible things that happened with some businesses and how they've kind of got away with it. And I think we've got to that place when it comes to financial issues that they're regulated, and it really hurts them when they do that. And the reputational damage that it does near enough breaks them as a business. Now, I don't want that, because that means those people are then made unemployed, etc. But I think, again, if they're going to do this, and it's got to have some teeth.
Yeah, and sometimes the teeth act as much as deterrent as anything else.
Yeah.
And like you say, if you know that there are going to be sanctions and that they're likely and that they're going to be serious, that forces you to take it seriously and, prep like Gareth has a couple of years ahead.
Yes, trying to.
Right. So I'm going to bring us onto the home straight now. But one of the things that I can say is that, look, we think the single enforcement body piece is actually almost key to making sure that the rest of this works in the way that it should do. So it's going to be one of the areas that we'll be politely requesting and pushing the government on.
I was just going to say, can I add a little bit at the end to that, which is to say, I think it feels like it's quite narrowly drawn at the moment, the Fair Work Agency. We don't know how well it's going to be resourced. That is a key question. An interesting thing in the legislation is that it will have a general power to take on existing enforcement powers that government already have. I'm not expecting that to be the thing that it starts to do on day one, but it does sort of open a slightly interesting door for us all in terms of actually what the future of that looks like, if it works, if they get it up and running in a way that is doing all the things that we've talked about. Actually, there is an opportunity for organisations like the CIPD, but for businesses generally, to kind of push for it to be a bit more expansive and do a bit more, potentially.
So I think it's always important in life to acknowledge your mistakes. Normally we only have 3 guests on here. We've had 4. I completely forgot that Cole was sitting off to my right-hand side. So... Hi, Cole.
I'm memorable.
He's been giving us the eye, depending on what we've said, so it's been okay.
Whereas I simply haven't caught Cole's eye for the last 40 minutes or so.
It was even the kick didn't work, but never mind.
Cole, would you be able to explain to us the changes and the framing? I think is important, from 0 hours contracts to guaranteed hours contracts, and the CIPD stance on this, just because I feel that we need your voice in this more at this point.
So, I mean, I think the headline today, I think, is that there's going to be consultation around all of this stuff, and I think you talked about on the unfair dismissal piece, 9 months is the preferred thing for government. Actually, there's going to be consultation around that. That's the same with 0 hours contracts. They've talked about having a preferred, I think, 12-week reference period, which will ensure organisations use that to set their hours, for employees. So I think that's the headline, is that there's going to be consultation. We're going to have an opportunity to kind of feed in on it.
So if you work in something that would currently be regarded as a 0 hours contract, and you do that for 12 weeks, you would then essentially have a reference period, potentially, if it was set at 12 weeks, where you'd look back and you'd have the right to essentially have a contract that kind of recognised that. You'd have the right to opt out of that, but it's designed to make sure that you don't have exploitative or one-sided employment practices where all of the burden of risk sits on the employee.
That was much better than the explanation that I started on. So thank you.
Well, look, I knew there was a reason I've been ignoring you, Carl.
There's an edit.
I'm going to pay for that for weeks. Can I just say that Carl and the team have been putting in such amazing shifts to get us up to speed and to get me in a position where I can actually cogently describe it. That's possibly the cheapest shot.
Trying to come back.
In this podcast.
You're trying to come back, Carl.
So what the government's trying to do is provide a degree of security of earnings. Implications for employers, really interesting on this one. I don't think anyone would ever defend any employment practice that could be termed exploitative. Equally, the level of flexibility that's provided historically for the employer and employee can sometimes be mutually beneficial. Any thoughts on this one before we close down?
I mean, hospitality, it relies a lot on zero-hour contracts. And I think it's become over-reliant. I think what happened during the pandemic was there was a big panic about actually offering people a set of hours purely and simply because during the pandemic we couldn't guarantee it. And so what suddenly became a trend, and has become a trend throughout hospitality, is offering zero-hour contracts as the first thing you do for majority of roles. I don't think there's a real need to, and there's a way in which you can work around this. And having they're talking about this 12-week period, I think it is possible to be able to work out for majority of those zero-hour contracts now, here's how many hours we can offer you and what we can do with that. There are some people and that it really works for. A zero-hour contract is a great thing. I mean, I worked in the leisure industry previously, and personal trainers would never sign anything other than a zero-hour contract because for them, they could earn more money elsewhere. And I think that's really key. And I think also for employers, flip that round for events companies, you can't guarantee hours. So there is a balance here. But I do think that there has been a bit of an over-reliance on zero-hour contracts, and I think there's a rebalance that's required with it.
So you'll have to explain to me at some point what a personal trainer is. It's an entirely new concept to me, so we'll pick that up afterwards. Any final thoughts on 0 hours? I know you've mentioned it.
Yeah, I think 0 hours are part of your employment toolkit, and it's a diverse way of working. It enables people to have that flexibility, and I wouldn't want to see that phased out as, the fire and rehire stuff that needs to be got rid of. So I think 0 hours, as long as you're using them fairly, as long as the individual is getting what they want out of it as well, and you have that framework, then I hope that they're here to stay, but in the way that we all want to use them effectively.
That's a really good point around fire and rehire as well. We haven't spoken about that, but that's another change which is perhaps more caveated than unions may have wanted, which is essentially that that notion of fire and rehire, so kind of mass change of terms and conditions, you will be able to do that, but only if it's essentially stopping the business from serious harm. So the existence of the business is at threat, is pretty much the way that it's framed in terms of it being a going concern. So that'll be an interesting one to again look at the justification, the range and space within that. Mel, final word with you.
On
0 hours contracts.
Oh,
or anything you like.
I don't know, because we moved on to listen, I think we can't be talking about modernisation and such like and empowering individuals and then treating them like, we know what's best for them. So I think there's definitely, you'd expect that from an independent, wouldn't you? But there's definitely a place for them for sure. I think technology is advancing where people can select in your industry and in other industries where you can select your own shifts, you can swap shifts, you can get that flexibility that you want in life and work loads of hours 1 month and less, anything that kind of stops that from happening where it's an individual's choice would be terrible. But also, I've been horrified of hearing some of the stories about, where people just can't live off of the way that they've been contracted.
Or they've been cancelled at the last minute and not paid.
Things like that. There's no place for that. So, again, this is where it's difficult with legislation, isn't it? Is trying to litigate against, what we consider is good human, ways of working in 2024.
I think the thing for me is it's a conversation with the employee, and even before they're an employee, that is the critical part. What works for you as well as works for us, and the balance between the two. And I think all of this is that's what it's really focused on, is, you know, having that conversation with the employee, seeing what hours they can work, what's going to work for us as a business. If you have those conversations early, then you don't get the bigger issues that come up later down the line.
Final thought from you, Carl. The invaluable Carl, who I couldn't live without. Carl.
Yeah, the word exploitative obviously has come up quite a few times when we've talked to employers about this. The phrasing in what was the Labour manifesto was they were going to ban exploitative 0 hours contracts. And I just wanted to throw in that actually we don't need to focus too much on that word anymore. We do have proposals, we have consultation. That word is a word that was used politically so that they could say the words ban and 0 hours contract without banning 0 hours contracts. I think we've reached the point now where we can kind of move on and say, actually, this is what it looks like. We don't have to worry about necessarily what they mean by exploitative. We just need to focus on the proposals.
Absolutely makes sense. Look, I'd like to thank everyone. So Mel, Gareth, Una, and the invaluable Carl. I cannot believe I forgot you for so long. I'm so sorry. Who will doubtless, that'll
Make
be a
you
problem.
pay.
Yeah, look, for anyone who's been listening today or watching today, the key messages from us as a professional body are, I think, probably threefold. One, you don't need to panic. As Gareth mentioned, what you do need is you do need to prepare. But actually, there are some things you can't prepare for yet, because if you believe the newspaper headlines, they're hurtling towards you. And the reality is this is going to be a long and complex process where there's still space for voice and still space for change. Second thing is that you have a chance to influence us, to then influence the government, because we're at the heart of these conversations, to make sure that those changes are as best informed as they can be. We're delighted to be in regular conversations with the government around this. We're genuinely right at the centre of the conversations. We're very happy that some of the things we've asked for have come to pass, and indeed the overframing ask that we've made around there being broader and longer consultations so that we can work through detail has also come to pass. So we'll do that as your professional body. And the third thing is we will keep our assets and our communication and what you need as a professional to see you through this period up to date. So keep visiting the website, keep looking for the updates. We'll make sure they're really prominent when they change. Our fact sheets and all of the other areas will change as and when needed to. What you won't find is speculative changes on our behalf, because our job is to make sure that you are properly equipped and properly informed. So really hope this has been helpful for you today. Please do keep staying involved with this. Please do keep using the things that we have. I mentioned it really briefly earlier. We've upgraded our website, so it's now far easier to find what you're after. And we'll keep working on those things. Expect more from us on the policy side as we pass through this period and continue to consult, but also on the practice side. It's our job as a professional body to make sure you've got what you need to do these things well and properly. So thank you to everyone who's contributed today. Next time, we'll go back to the more normal format, funny stuff, talking about practical stuff that's probably happened that week rather than things that may happen in 3 years' time. But thank you very much for listening. This has been the CIPD HR People Pod.